They said she was France's chosen mother, destined to secure a crown she was too young to even spell. But the truth hiding behind the palace doors was far more terrifying. On the night her body began to fail under a weight no 12-year-old should ever carry, the future king didn't rush to her side. He rushed to the heir, his heir, leaving her alone in a silent chamber where even the midwife refused to meet her eyes. And when the doors finally opened, the court didn't ask if the girl had survived. They only asked whether the child would live long enough to wear the crown. That was the moment the palace understood. This was not a royal birth. It was a sacrifice. There are stories whispered through Europe's old stone corridors that feel too heavy to belong to legend, yet too fragile to survive as ordinary history. Stories where power and innocence collide so violently that the echo of it stretches across centuries. And among the darkest of these is the life of a young girl whose name barely appears in textbooks, yet whose fate shaped the future of a kingdom. She was 12 years old, still learning to braid her hair properly, still collecting pressed flowers in the margins of her schoolbook, when she was told her destiny was no longer her own. She was to bear the heir to France, and her childhood ended the moment a king pointed to her and said, "She will do." If you enjoy this dark histories, leave a like and subscribe. Comment below where you are watching from. I'm genuinely curious to know where this story reached. Her name was Élodie de Marivaux, the daughter of a minor noble house tucked deep within the forests of northern France. Her family was neither wealthy nor influential, but they carried old blood, respectable lineage, the kind that could be used to strengthen alliances when needed. And at that time, France needed alliances more desperately than anyone dared admit. The old king was sick. The royal advisors were restless. And the heir, young, ambitious, and hungry for legitimacy, was under pressure to secure the future of his line before the throne slipped from his grasp. He was 24 years old. Brilliant, educated, adored by the court, feared by his rivals. A man raised to carry a crown that weighed heavier with each passing year. His position was unstable, his alliances fragile. And so the advisors suggested a marriage, not for love, not for companionship, but for symbolism. They needed a bride who was pure, untouched by politics, whose family was loyal but powerless, someone who could be molded into a silent ornament of the monarchy. And Élodie was perfect. She had been brought to the palace during spring festivities, her mother insisting she wear her finest embroidered dress. She had never seen rooms so large, ceilings so high, candles so bright they made her squint. She walked behind her parents quietly, her hands clasped together, admiring everything with wide, timid eyes. The courtiers who passed by smiled politely, but mostly they ignored her. To them she was a child, something soft and unimportant. Yet one pair of eyes did not ignore her. The future king watched her across the hall. Not with affection, not with admiration, but with calculation, as though she were a piece on a board he had suddenly realized he needed. Her youth was not a concern to him. In his world, royalty married for strategy, not age, and the younger the bride, the easier she was to shape into a symbol. By the end of that gathering, Élodie's fate was sealed. Her parents were summoned privately. They returned pale-faced, speaking to each other in strained whispers Élodie could not decipher. Days later, a procession of royal messengers arrived at their estate. The king had chosen her. There was no proposal. There was no discussion. There was only an announcement. Her mother wept quietly while brushing Élodie's hair that night. Her father could not meet her eyes. And Élodie, confused but obedient, tried her best to understand why everyone seemed to hold their breath around her. At 12, she was escorted to the palace. From the moment she arrived, the world she knew dissolved. She was placed under the supervision of strict attendants who instructed her on posture, etiquette, and silence. She was taught how to walk without making noise, how to bow without trembling, how to smile without showing teeth. Every day she wore gowns far too heavy for her small frame, and every night she cried into sheets embroidered with gold. The future king visited her rarely, yet his presence dictated every decision in her life. When he did see her, he spoke to her the way one might speak to an object, admiring its value without acknowledging its soul. Élodie tried her best to be what they wanted, repeating the lessons she was given, memorizing the phrases she was told to recite. But she was still a child. She still slipped and skipped when she forgot to be composed. She still asked naive questions, and in the palace, naivety was a dangerous luxury. Months passed, and then came the night that changed everything. It was early winter, the air crisp, the moon hanging low over the palace roofs. Elodie sat in her chambers, braiding ribbons through her doll's hair. She still played when the attendants weren't watching, still clung to tiny pieces of childhood. But tonight the palace felt different, too quiet, too watchful. A knock came at her door, a soft knock, but the kind that carried authority. What happened next would never be written in official accounts. The palace chroniclers avoided such details, but what is known, what whispered testimonies confirm, is that not long after that night physicians were sent to examine Elodie, and their expressions when they emerged carried a mixture of astonishment and fear. She was pregnant. At 12 years old. The news spread through the palace like smoke under a locked door. Servants froze mid-task. Ladies in waiting exchanged glances heavy with meaning. Advisors whispered urgently in the corridors. Even the king, upon hearing the confirmation, sat in silence for a long time before murmuring, "Good. Let the people see destiny has chosen us." Destiny. They called it destiny. But destiny did not explain the quiet tremors in Elodie's hands. Destiny did not explain why the attendants now hovered around her as though she might break. Destiny did not explain why the royal midwife, an older woman with kind eyes, kept her hands clasped tightly whenever Elodie walked into the room. The months that followed blurred into a haunting quiet. Elodie grew paler, smaller somehow, as though the weight of the palace pressed down on her ribs. She no longer had lessons, no longer had visitors. She spent most of her time staring through the window at the gardens she was no longer allowed to walk in. The dolls she once adored sat untouched in a corner. The future king visited occasionally, but his presence only deepened the tension in the room. He spoke proudly of the future heir, of France's stability, of alliances solidifying behind the scenes. He never asked her how she felt, not once. And then came the night when the palace braced itself. The candles burned low, attendants moved swiftly, and the midwife closed the doors tightly behind her. Hours passed. Whispers crept through the palace like a storm wind. When the doors finally opened, the midwife emerged, carrying a small swaddled bundle. The future king arrived moments later, his expression unreadable. He did not go to Elodie first. He went to the infant. A future king, they proclaimed, born of a royal mother blessed by destiny. But Elodie lay silent. And for the first time the palace realized something terrifying. The girl who had been chosen to secure an empire was no longer a child, no longer free, no longer whole. Her body survived the ordeal, but her innocence, her spirit, the brightness in her eyes, all had faded into a quiet that unsettled even the coldest attendants. She remained in the palace for years, raised her son with gentle devotion, always polite, always quiet, a ghost of the child who once carried ribbons and dolls. And the king? He rose to power, strengthened his alliances, and wrapped his reign in the polished glory of a lineage secured. But he never understood the truth whispered behind velvet curtains, that his legacy rested not on triumph or strategy, but on the life of a 12-year-old girl who had never been given a choice. History tried to bury her story, but the walls of the palace remembered, the servants remembered, the midwife remembered, and now so do we, a horror hidden in history, made real by a child who never asked to bear a crown.